Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Another reminder that tonight's speaker event is being recorded. My name is Emily Spence, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome, and thank you for attending and supporting tonight's talk. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our friends at Hubtown Tours for their continued support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. This year, as we commemorate America's 250th anniversary, we have lots of exciting programming planned. On March 25th, we will be joined by Lori Rogers Stokes for a deep dive into Boston's Puritan origins and the influence it has on the history and culture of Boston today. And on April 16th, we will be hosting our annual Lantern and Luminaries event on site. We are pleased to share that this year's honoree will be Keith Lockhart, conductor of the Boston Pops. More information about tickets will be available soon. And then also I invite you to keep an eye on our socials. We have a special, I guess, event planned for later this week. The artist Silence Dogood will be at Old North on the evening of Friday the 13th to do some projections on the church. So I invite you to either join us for that or to keep an eye on our socials for images of that. And as always, I hope you will visit us at Old North. We will be open next week for school vacation week here in Massachusetts. Please check our website for hours. And we'll be opening for the 2026 season on March 21st. Or sorry, on March 1st. And now I am delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Jen Manion. Questions of gender identity and sexuality are nothing new. Long before people identified as transgender or lesbian, there were female husbands, people assigned female at birth, who transgender, lived as men, and entered into legal marriages with women. Early America is filled with histories of queer pioneers, from female husbands to sailors, children, and prisoners. During the early Republic and antebellum period, these stories were featured in newspapers, magazines, and children's literature. In their talk this evening, historian Jen Manion will examine these queer and trans stories that appeared in print. They'll explore questions like, how were queer and trans people presented in print media at the time? What can these stories tell us about the lives of queer and trans people? And what were their experiences like prior to the medicalization and the invention of modern categories such as homosexual and transgender? Jen Manion is a social and cultural historian whose work examines the role of gender and sexuality in American life. Manion is the Winkley Professor of History at Amherst College and Department Chair of Sexuality, Women's, and Gender Studies. Drawing on their expertise in U.S. history, Manion's writings cover a broad range of topics, including the origins of prisons in America, transgender history and politics, and the LGBTQ movement. Manion has written two award-winning books, Liberty's Prisoners, Carceral Culture in Early America, and Female Husbands, A Trans History, and dozens of essays, including one in the New England Journal of Medicine about historic injustice towards LGBTQ people, and one in the New Republic on transgender history as a form of political resistance. Before joining Amherst College, Manion worked for a decade as the founding director of the LGBTQ Center at Connecticut College and as a faculty member in the Department of History. Thank you, Jen, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, and before we get started, I'll just remind
Yeah.
everyone to please mute your microphones and to put any questions that you have in the chat. There's going to be some time at the end for Jen to answer those questions. And now, Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for logging on tonight. Okay, are you able to see my slides,
Yes,
Emily?
thank you. Yeah,
Okay,
this is
wonderful.
great.
Okay. Okay, these are some of the big questions that I hope to address tonight. Were there queer and trans people in early America? Very importantly for this crowd, how do we explore this history in a way that's true to us, um, true to the time, but also legible to us, right? And that's kind of can be a source of tension, but that's in some ways where some of the most interesting information is. And then why is it important for us to grapple with the meaning and significance of these histories? Okay, excuse me. I'm a little Zoom talk rusty, which is shocking after all those years. Um, I'm going to talk about a lot of different queer and trans figures, but the heart of this work are female husbands. And actually, that book arrived in March 2020 with the pandemic. So we have spent a lot of time together on Zoom screens. Before I jump into some of that detail, I just want to offer people a bit of a broad context here for U.S. trans history, in case it's something people aren't familiar with, and also because everything I'm going to talk about tonight happens before this period, right? So when we typically think about trans history, we think about this kind of timeline. In the 1840s are really when we get some of the earliest anti-cross-dressing laws, but not that many until after the Civil War. The medical pathologization of homosexuality and gender nonconformity really takes off in the 1890s. And then, of course, the good things, the resistance, the trans medicine starts in the 1950s, trans protests and resistance in the 1960s. The modern movement and a lot of the terminology that I'm going to use tonight are rooted in the 1990s. And then, of course, we have this tiny little block of time now, really the 21st century where we are, where we've seen both tremendous gains and tremendous backlash. So I think it's helpful just to kind of look at this in space and see the moment that we're living through is really just a tiny little blip, a small piece of a much bigger story. Just some terminology. These are the definitions that are widely used in queer and trans studies right now, so that we have a shared understanding of what I mean when I say them. Transgender is typically used both as an umbrella term for all kinds of gender variants and as movement away from the gender expression expected of you. So you might notice these are kind of broad, capacious categories. And that's one reason why they actually work well in historical studies, where we really don't have access to people's interiority or their own statements of their own identity, their own pronouns, concepts that are very modern. Similarly, queer comes out of the 1990s and queer theory. And in many ways, it's as much what it isn't as what it is, right? So queer is saying you're not straight, you're not cis, you're rejecting certain gender and sexual norms, you're rejecting binaries. And so it helps us have these kinds of broad conceptual tools on the table for this conversation in one way to get at some really exciting figures who lived extraordinary lives in the past, but who we ultimately really have no way of ever truly trying to map onto our own contemporary language and terminology. But that doesn't mean that they're still not relevant to our history and that there's not a story there that's like really rich and fun to think about. Finally, one of the reasons why I kind of titled this like in print culture because 90% of the sources that I have and the material that we end up working with to find out about these amazing queer and trans lives were printed somewhere, right? So they're mostly in newspapers, sometimes in broadsides, sometimes in pamphlets. And so they're highly mediated texts, right? They're not really people's diaries or personal letters, but they're stories about them. We're usually like there's kind of a lot of people involved. Sometimes there's an employer, there's a neighbor, there's a boss, there's a judge, when people end up in court, a policeman, and then the journalists who end up finding out about these cases. And, these are really popular human interest stories. There's an explosion of print media and news. And so there's a lot of desire for interesting content that's going to get people to pick up newspapers. So in many respects, so much of what we know is actually shaped and determined by how we know it, and that is through these highly mediated sources. So I think that's valuable to kind of put up front because it kind of gives us some realistic expectations about how much we're ever going to get answers to, what motivated someone, what they really felt, what this really meant to them. But instead, we end up getting a lot of information about what other people thought of them and what they did, and that's actually really instructive and interesting too. Some of the key terms that pop up are these, they're somewhere between, neutral and derogatory, usually in the way that they're used. But it is also one way that scholars can even find these sources. And a lot of times it's, these contradictions, male and female in the same category, modifiers, things that aren't meant to be together. And that kind of signals it's a common way that people described queer and trans figures in the past. I'm going to walk us through four different sites, really four different kinds of records, just to give you a sense of range of experiences and the way they were covered. So the London case is an early female husband case, a couple that I spent a lot of time with. I wrote a whole chapter about them actually in my book. The Philadelphia case is really unusual essay in the Juvenile Miscellany by Eliza Leslie, which is really instructive about what boys and girls should and shouldn't do in terms of how they express their gender. The third case from New York is someone sometimes referred to as Peter Sawali or Mary Jones, um, who was a famous, there's a lot of records about them. And they're potentially one of the most controversial cases in terms of how we talk about them. Historians really used to describe and think about them as a gay man, and now in more recent times, given our broader vocabulary about the centrality of gender in people's lives, people really think about them as a trans femme figure who should be spoken of as such. So you'll kind of see some of that playing out in the sources. And then finally, some female sailors, and there are tons of female sailors in the newspaper in the 19th century. So, who were female husbands? Female husbands, this was when this phrase was used, it very specifically meant all of these things. Someone was raised as a girl, they transgender, which usually meant cutting your hair, changing your name, changing the way you dressed. We're not really talking about medical intervention um, in any of these cases yet. But they lived fully as men, and in most cases are passing and living as men in their community, and also married to women, right? So, female husband is a category described all of these things when it was used. It circulated in British culture. Its roots are in 1746. And it came over, to the US. Well, actually, it came over all along because North American newspapers reprinted stories from these British cases. So there was like a lot of interest in appeal in the British, colonies. And then we have one of our first cases of a North American female husband in 1836. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about them as well. And it follows the same trajectory. And this category is popular really until sexuality. So the late 19th century, the 1880s, 1890s, all of these kinds of gender variant expressions end up getting heavily stigmatized, medicalized, and kind of consolidated into this category of sexual inversion, which is really the root diagnosis for what becomes homosexuality. So, in some respects, it's, the 19th century is kind of like a gender free-for-all. Like there is a lot of fluidity, a lot of possibility, and that really all gets collapsed and consolidated into something derogatory um, by the end of the 19th century. But we're not concerned with that part yet. We get to kind of have some fun first. So here are a couple records to help bring to life the story of James Howe and Mary Snapes. They were legal, they met as teenagers. They were both poor and put out to work by their families, which was not uncommon. They worked on their feet at physically demanding labor every day at the bar. And this is a picture, a later picture, of course, of a bar that they owned in East London in the 1750s and 60s. And so they ran this bar together. They worked, they paid taxes, they went to church, they donated to the needy, they saved money. They were having a pretty good life, probably better than either of them expected, given their class backgrounds and the turmoil that marked their childhood. They actually decided together when they were teenagers that James would present as a man and that they would legally marry and go through the world in this way. And they were married for 34 years. And like the couple pictured here, they were married outside of Fleet Prison in the 18th century. So one of the questions that their case raises is, how involved the queer wives were. A lot of these stories really privilege the female husband, and often, portray the queer wives as maybe sometimes not knowing that their husbands had transgender or that they were duped. And, this is a case where it seems really likely that they made this decision together and that Mary knew exactly what she was getting into. And, maybe it was even her idea, right? So, and sometimes we kind of have to read between the lines to try to fill out, well, what was possibly happening? How should we possibly understand this? Um, because these queer wives like Mary were often viewed as like normal or straight and, as victims of deception. But we really think that Mary chose to marry James, her female husband. Now, this was, what the main moment that we end up learning about a lot of the people I'm going to talk about are when they were outed, and in a moment of tragedy. And here it is a little so. What happened is that Mary Snapes died, and Mary Howe, Snapes was her maiden name, and James was being blackmailed by someone who recognized them from childhood. And there was a moment where James was sort of tired of paying off the blackmailer and also really scared because they brought in a couple people to impersonate um, police and said that James was actually going to, breaking a terrible law and going to be executed for impersonating a man. And so there's a lot to this case, but I'll just kind of short circuit to the end. James was used to being really respected in the community and was like really good friends with the authorities, but also felt like as long as he was still living and presenting as a man, he was vulnerable. So he sort of, runs to the local authorities and, outs himself and is like, here's my legal birth name. I was really born a woman, and ends up suing the blackmailer and taking them to court for impersonating authorities and harassing them and winning. And they end up going to jail. But it's actually this is, kind of in order to have all of that happen, James had to kind of, um, you know, give up their identity and give up their gender, at least for a time. So in these stories, this snippet I have here, there's also a lot of this stuff floating around online. You could just search for it. Um, it describes James sitting in court in women's attire and how uncomfortable they look and how awkward the community felt because of that. So it's like a hard story, but it's also really interesting. Um, this story is really important because it lives on and on and on. So this is one of the most widely commented on, reprinted, recirculated female husband stories that existed. For over 100 years, people used it, sometimes with their names, sometimes without their names. So this is a case where James Howe's, birth name was Mary East, and Bram Stoker had this book that he put together called Famous Imposters. And again, to our sensibilities, this seems derogatory, this seems anti-trans. Um, but it was also one of the ways that these stories were kept alive. And so you're just like opening a book and you're like, oh, and then this happened. Oh, and, and people transgender. And so you keep, getting the story gets resurrected generation after generation. And it's really interesting to kind of read some of these texts against each other to see the context in which they were written, the purpose for which they were written. Sometimes they're neutral, sometimes they're derogatory, sometimes they're like respectful and positive. So there's a lot to see in how print culture, reproduces and circulates this material over time in different contexts. These stories, I stumbled into these when I was doing research at the American Antiquarian Society, which is an incredible resource in Worcester, for doing research. And this is so weird because, Eliza Leslie became, I mean, she was a famous writer, but she ended up becoming most famous for her cookbooks. Um, but she wrote this for the Juvenile Miscellany when it was under, the control of Lydia Marie Child. And so it's a pretty important children's publication from the era. There was a companion piece also. There's one about the boy girl. I didn't feature it here because I have so much other content about people with that experience. But here it is, and it's really this like detailed, portrayal of a boy who embraces like all things like girly and feminine and was met with judgment and mockery, right? So Billy's described as a pretty boy with golden curly hair who perfumed himself and slept with gloves on so that his hands would stay white and delicate. He rejected all of the activities, right, that boys were supposed to play, and instead he liked to socialize with girls, and people teased him and called him a girl boy. The author contends that Billy's mother was responsible for overindulging her young son. And the story goes on. And of course, episode after episode, there's a sea captain, of course, the beacon of masculinity, whose young son is a little bully that tries to intimidate Billy and get him, to kind of stop presenting as a woman or as a girl and embracing, feminine things. And as you can see, if you look at the second paragraph here, it works, right? So this is kind of a terrible account of bullying, but you see it's in this prescriptive children's literature. And, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I mean, we might wonder, well, what are we supposed to think about Billy? Is Billy in our terms? Would we think of Billy as effeminate, as maybe an effeminate gay man, maybe as a trans femme person, maybe who's, just a kid experimenting and who knows like what this actually means to them and where he's going to end up. So in some way, it again, it creates space for highlighting, this practice. And there's one way to read this, which is like visibility and connection, like if you're also that kid. But of course, its purpose was very much a cautionary tale. This is not how you want your children to end up. And that you, as a parent, if you enable your children to express gender in this kind of ways, that is your fault, right? So it's also teaching parents the importance of not letting children make these choices for themselves. So, and that's from 1832. I set most of this stuff up chronologically just so we could also kind of see it unfolding. A lot of it is really antebellum era. There's a fair amount of material online at this point about about Mary Jones as well. The New York State Archives ended up, really going through their records and pulling a lot of these primary sources out and making them available, supplementing, some of the material that historians had to work with for a while. But Mary Jones was a pretty well-known sex worker and skilled pickpocket in New York City in the 1830s. But it was only after police initiated a sting operation that led to her arrest and detention that they really suspected that she was maybe not a woman. So this led to a rather unique interrogation pictured here. And this also kind of puts us on notice again that our current approach to names and pronouns and gender is new or new enough that it doesn't always, translate backwards. Because in this case, Mary Jones is asked her name and she says, my name is Peter Sawali. I'm a man. And so there are a lot of different ways for us to think about this. On the one hand, these are extremely stressful circumstances when you're being detained and interrogated by the police, and your life, your livelihood, and your freedom are on the line. So you can see on the one hand, you're going to say whatever you have to say to get out. But this is also an interesting record where we do have some of, Mary's own voice. So the police asked, "What induced you to dress yourself in women's clothes?" And Jones answered, "I have been in the practice of waiting upon girls of ill fame and made up their beds and received the company at the door and received the money for the rooms. And they induced me to dress in women's clothes, saying I looked so much better in them. And I have always attended parties among the people of my own color dressed in this way." So, as I alluded to in the beginning, historians have approached this case very differently over the years. Initially, just classifying Jones as a gay man who presented as female to have sexual intimacies with men, sometimes in exchange for money. But of course, now we also see the resonances of Jones as potentially a non-binary person or a trans femme, in which her gender expression was actually a really important part of the way she moved through the world and could have been just as important or perhaps even more important than sexuality. Jones was incarcerated for good chunks of time in the 1840s and 50s for grand larceny. And this case does challenge us to consider the incredible obstacles for African Americans making a living in this era, which was compounded, of course, by further restrictions for trans and queer people, and also how proximity to criminality and carceral authorities are really key components of life for people on the margins, especially during this era and afterwards. Charles Williams is, living at the same time in the same place as Mary Jones. And one of the reasons why I put this in here is because I think they were potentially in the same prison at the same time. Um, this is one of the countless records of quote unquote female sailors in the 19th century press. They're super fun. They're also hard to work with because they're they often don't have enough identifying information to kind of track that person down through the records. I mean, so this is one of the few people that I put in my book who I wasn't able to also find either their birth name or Charles Williams in a, series of other records to kind of verify. But I include it because I think it's indicative of a couple things, including again, the tremendous restrictions on African American mobility at this time. So it's like still a slave nation. And a lot of the heightened restrictions on vagrancy and cross-dressing and movement are, because of the policing of free blacks and the effort to track down formerly enslaved people. So there's a tone here which is absent from a lot of the female sailor records that talk about white people, right? So the female sailors who are white, they're quaint, simple New Englanders, who kind of went off on adventure. Whereas, in this kind of representation about Charles Williams, he was convicted, he was sent to prison, and all of this kind of comes out in the process of their imprisonment. And so there's less celebration, and there's also certainly there's not an effort to connect them to a kinship network with like female husbands. So it's just one way that there's a lot of editorial discretion, again, that shapes how we encounter these records and what we get to know about people and then what we don't get to know. I'm still in the 1830s. A lot of this is happening in New York. And this is really the first North American female husband. So George Wilson and Elizabeth Cummins, it just follows the same exact pattern that I outlined in the beginning. So Georgia socializes a girl, trans is gender, begins living as a man, goes to work in a factory in Scotland that Elizabeth Cummins' father also worked in. They end up getting married, and shortly after they get married, they come over to North America, first to Canada, and then they make their way down um, to New York. And so they were married for, I think, 15 years. I don't have the date on here for this, but they were married for a good chunk of time. And at some point, basically, George Wilson, they were living and working in New York City. George Wilson was a hat maker in the Lower East Side and is basically found intoxicated in the street. And so this is like one of the first stories that comes out about a quote unquote female husband in North America. And at first, the police officer thought they were a sailor. They were sort of wearing sailor type garb, then realized they weren't. First, the policeman thought they were a man. Then they thought maybe they weren't a man. They brought them into the station. And here it says James Walker because this is the first telling of it. George spins this tall tale which and then at some point, Elizabeth comes into the station, finds him. There's a lot of detail in the media about this interrogation in the police station, and then we learn that it's really George Wilson and Elizabeth Cummins who actually we are able to verify their marriage and a lot of other details about their life and time together. But this is sort of like marks the arrival of the female husband in North America. Another female sailor, I just put this in to give you some sense of the scope and range. And that, I think one of the important things to keep in mind is, well, what happens? People get caught, people get outed, they get punished a little bit, they get detained, they get interrogated. Sometimes there's a little bit of punishment, but not really. The punishment is ungendering. That's your punishment. Your punishment is you can't keep living as this gender. You can't keep expressing yourself this way. For most of the 19th century, it really is just thought, that gender is an expression, it's something you do, you put on, you take off. It's not deeper than that. And so the good news is when you get caught transing gender in a way that you're not supposed to, it doesn't reveal anything profound about you. You just like did this thing, excuse me, and they want you to not do it anymore. So that's kind of the approach. And so this is a case, but people keep doing it again and again and again. So I think even though you have this dominant attitude that cross-dressing or transing gender is like casual, loose, the people who do get caught and punished and told not to do this anymore, there's significant evidence that they don't listen, right? So this is a case where, George Johnson, gets caught, and you can't do this while they're out at sea again. And there's all this stuff in the record about what a great sailor they were, even though it was their first time working as a hand, and they were green. They crawled up to the top of the mast, even in terrible weather, and they did a great job. At the same time, as soon as the captain was informed or suspected or figured out that they were assigned female, They're like, no, you can't do this anymore. And you have to put on a dress and go sit in the corner of the ship until we get back. So there is a way that, gender normativity and just kind of keeping everything in its place trumps labor needs and other concerns that might have organized or motivated, how people worked on the ship while you're far away at sea. This does not deter George Johnson. They show up again, years later in a factory in Westfield. And I can't even tell you how I pieced this together. The name is not in this article, but I did. There's another article that allowed me to kind of eventually piece it all together, that these are the same people. Children's literature, and then we're going to talk about, the famed revolutionary soldier that everybody might have expected that I would talk about the whole time. Um, and then we'll, go to questions. So this again, this is a children's book. The McLaughlin brothers were like, the most popular publishers of children's books at this time. The American Antiquarian Society has an incredible collection and an incredible librarian who can kind of introduce you to this collection. And as soon as I got there, she showed me this. This is not something I had seen before, anybody I knew had worked with before as a text. You're like, why were we denied the tomboy who was changed into a real boy our whole lives? Like, we've needed this forever. This is a great story. People think it might be based on the real Mary Talbot, who was a famed British female sailor, who had, a memoir or a pamphlet written about who was actually the daughter of an earl. But one of the reasons why this is so fun is, again, just kind of gives voice to the experience of, those of us who are, not comfortable with the norms and activities and roles that people expect us to do. And so you kind of have this playing out in this children's book, and then they're basically like, okay, all right. So this is what she wants, and her attitudes became so like a boys that they thought it was only right on a certain summer's night to change her sex completely without noise. And so a sailor she was made, and a ship's captain was paid quite quietly to take her off to CCC. There, for anything I know, this said tomboy maybe now, and a caution. Oh, I can't see it. I can't see the bottom. Uh, and a caution may it prove to you and me. I'm not sure what the caution is exactly about, but we could talk about that in the Q&A. So, if this material is new to you, it's just kind of incredible. It's actually not new to me at all, and I still think it's incredible every time I read it, that this was the story in a children's book in 1859. So, um, and I think this is full of possibility and actually optimism and not really negative in the way that some of the other records are. Finally, we could talk about our friend Robert Shirtliff. Um, I brought here for you to see this is one of the first news stories that was written about them in 1784. So we know they served from 1782 to part of 1783. And this is an early account about that service. And if we don't really have time probably to read the whole thing, but part of what I think is so interesting in the framing of them is all of the different ways that they explain, what made it possible for someone who was assigned female, raised as a girl, to transgender and to live as a man and to fight in the war. And so here we see near the bottom the cause of personating a man it is said, proceeded from the rigor of her parents who exerted their prerogative to induce her marriage with a young man she had conceived a great antipathy for, together with her being a remarkable heroine and warmly attached to the cause of her country, in the service of which it must be acknowledged she gained reputation, and no doubt will be noticed by the compilers of the history of our grand revolution. She passed by the name Robert Shirtliff while in the army, and was born on the rolls of the regiment as such. For particular reasons, her real name is withheld, but the facts aforementioned are unquestionable and unblemished. So I think one of the things that I like to think about here is, what it means for us to take a beat and sit with the person named Robert Shirtliff, the person who said, I'm going to transgender and present myself as a man and go to war as a man, and did this for 17 months. And that whole time is embodying and embracing manhood, masculinity, and Robert Shirtliff. And that I'm not interested in a feminist queer trans fight over how they should be classified. I think it's really interesting because it is true that they were like the first woman to receive a pension. It is true that they went on to present as a woman and marry a man and live something that looks like a conventional heterosexual life. And it's also true that they chose to change their gender and live in the world as a man for 17 months, actually longer. We know they were presenting as a man for longer. 17 months was their time enlisted. And so that also affected them, and that was significant and not insignificant. And that there's a lot of other detail in the writing um, about how they were able to do it that I think is actually really interesting and fun to think about. And I read a little bit about that in my book. Um, and some takeaways, I think a lot of these figures really blurred the categories of man and woman. There are people who embrace gender practices that were not typically associated with their sex. Many of them persisted in expressing themselves in the face of arrest, rejection, and hostility. And of course, the concept of gay, lesbian, trans identity did not exist, right? And so, in some respects, there could have been more room for experimentation and fluidity. And certainly, that informs one of the ways that people responded to people who did live queer and trans lives, maybe in some ways differently than what we might expect, or how we would react or try to understand them today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. Well, we still have plenty of time for questions. So if you have some questions, please do put them in the chat. I've been seeing a few roll in here. And so there's one here that caught my eye that I'd love to start with, which is why do men who like traditionally feminine things in our society, would say, our society today, our society in the 18th and 19th century, why are they viewed as wrong?
That's a huge question. I certainly
Yeah.
don't have the answer for it, but I think the piece of it that, I can speak to is that certainly resonates in my 19th century research is, it's a patriarchal society and masculinity is superior. So being a man is like the best. They have all the rights, all the economic, political, legal, social power and autonomy. So for those people to give up any of that is seen very differently than what it means for women or people assigned female at birth to aspire to it and to claim some of it. It's just so it's when you're analyzing these kind of records against each other, many times there's like opposite forces and kind of pulling on the interpretation of it, because of patriarchy.
There's another question here. I'm interested in the use of the term passing in the Shirkless case. Are there links between that term in use of transgender cases in the same way that it is used for racial passing or African Americans passing as white?
And that's also a very hard question. I'd have to, was the word passing in that actual article? Um, I, I'd have to actually look back about the distinction between when it's actually in the records themselves. I sometimes use it when I'm speaking just to try to reinforce or drive home the fact that people were like living undetected, right? So in many respects, I'm like a female husband too. Like I am a queer trans person, but I'm not passing or living fully as a man. And so I think that's like so even just me talking about it, trying to say, they were like passing undetected. I sometimes say to help signal or drive home the fact that they are like living that life, which might be different than like masculine women or people who are challenging gender norms, but it not in the same if, not in the same way. Um, and yeah, I mean, I can't even talk to the topic of racial passing. It's so important and complicated. And there, maybe if I just said, something that connects it all is if you know the case of the Crafts, who escaped slavery in part through some combination of racial and gender passing, right? And that's like a really important narrative that might be a place if you're, pursuing this in a deeper way that you really want to see how these categories are kind of described and tracked in relation to each other.
So next question, do you have any insight on the history of the term Boston marriage?
Is there someone else on the call that can take this? So I wrote this whole book. I come from a proud working class rural, family life in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that always bothered me about this period in queer history is that the only women who got to be queer were rich, educated, elite women. And those are your Boston marriages, right? So the Boston marriage is definitely this middle to upper class um, arrangement where, we can debate all day, to what extent any of these relationships were sexual or anyone thought they were sexual, but it was kind of part of this, bigger bucket called romantic friendship, where it was acceptable because of coming back to patriarchy, because of like the sharply gendered, segregated social customs that for women to have really strong, intimate, emotional bonds with each other where they are literally, each other's primary person into adulthood was accepted and celebrated. So I think for some romantic marriages, they're coexisting with a heterosexual marriage. And for some, they are two women literally living a house together. And, that would be kind of the people that we have in mind when we say the Boston marriage. So it's kind of in this big bucket of quote unquote lesbian like, right? Um, but it's a super classed category. And the female husbands, female sailors, part of what drew me to them is that's like the working class queer story. I don't think I really made a point of that in my talk, but that's a way that people who don't have access to, financial security or family inheritance or education are still able to find freedom, mobility, and some kind of queer trans space for themselves. That's the female sailor, female soldier, female husband people.
Do you find, just a follow-up to that, have you found in your research that that class distinction made a difference in how accepted these relationships were?
I mean, yeah, I think the interesting. So, I mean, Boston marriages were like a largely normative, like acceptable social arrangement, and to what extent people truly believed these women were asexual because they wanted to, that was like pretty okay. And yeah, the people who transgender and are kind of they're always more precarious and vulnerable. Yeah. And they don't have almost by definition, most of them had to run away from their families or leave their families and to transgender and reinvent themselves. So they're much more precarious socially and economically and not supported, right? I mean, there's an out, even though the punishment is not like what it was for sodomy, right? Which was a way that gay men were targeted. The punishment for sodomy was much more severe. So the punishment is like much lower stakes, but it still can destroy your whole life, if you're outed and you have to move. Um, excuse me. So and part of, I'll just say the final point I'll say is in most cases, we actually don't know what happens to these people after they appear in our records. So they're in the news, there's a flurry of coverage. Sometimes you can stitch them together over time, which I've done with a couple people. Sometimes you can verify birth, death, marriage, taxes, things like this. But a lot of times we lose track of them. And so we don't necessarily know like the disruptive impact of um, being outed and kind of how it ultimately like affected their life and well-being. Great
Um,
questions. Thank you all.
yeah,
This is
no,
fun.
and this next one is a great question. What are some strategies for reading these texts against the grain for insights into queer experience?
Yeah, it's I I'm trying, so I think it's still like, well, there's two things. One is like how negative some of it is. So that's like hard, of course. Like I don't think I could have done this. Like I would have been so mad if I tried to do this when I was like younger. So there's just like a lot of derogatory stuff in the tone and belittling and mocking, and it's not for everyone or at every moment of their life, I guess I would say. Um, but once you get used to that, then when there are positive to neutral to curious comments, it's just like amazing. And you're like, everyone wasn't terrible. Something was possible. Oh my God. Like there's this one guy, he was like the coroner in London, Thomas Shelton, and he was presented the case of James Allen. I didn't talk about them, but James and Mary Allen, married for 20 or 30 years. James dies in a workplace accident in a shipyard. And but he's like kind of dying on the way to the hospital. They're not sure, so they rush him to the hospital and they declare him dead and investigate his body and say this is the body of a woman. And so there's this like whole hubbub, and the coworkers are there, the boss is there, the wife is there, the friends, the neighbors, and there's just this like, how do we figure out what to make of this person and how to understand this life? And there's really like contradictory evidence because there's a whole community of coworkers, friends, and wife who are like, this person's a man. And then you have these medical students who are dressing the body, and they're like, this person was a female and not intersex, not hermaphrodite. They were a perfect female. And then you have Thomas Shelton, the coroner, who's like an old man. Like he retires like 2 months after this happens. And he's like, I have the marriage certificate here. And he is a man married to Mary. And that's what the marriage certificate says. And that's what's true. And because that's so, I will use male pronouns to refer to him. Because the press is like, why are you, saying he, there's she and all this. So it's like every once in a while there's like a Thomas Shelton. And I'm like, there can be decent people who are like, why do I have to destroy this person's life and reputation? Like that there are competing registers of truth. And and I'm gonna pick this one because it seems like the correct thing to me or the right thing to do.
So our next question, do you think that the resistance to non-mainstream gender identity and sexuality is greater during the current administration than during the 18th/19th century? And a follow-up to that is, what is the supposed threat of nonconformity that causes such a strong, severe reaction by the conservative right? Why do they care so strongly and severely?
Very hard question. I'm sure everyone on this call has their own answers. So, um, it's sort of, it's like definitely you know, it's like an apples to a fried chicken kind of question. Let me just say that because we have so much right now. Like we are have so many legal rights as queer and trans people and have such like strong social and cultural like visibility and recognition and education. I mean, just think about like, and if you were in school, what you learned in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s about any of this versus what everybody's been learning for the last 30 years. Like, so the context in which we are now being attacked and undermined and targeted and vilified is from a place in which we have so much. And I know what we have isn't like distributed evenly, and that some people are certainly more vulnerable and precarious than others, but like there is no denying the impact of 50 years of education and organizing that like is the foundation on which, I mean, I could just think about people in my own life, what they thought 20 or 30 years ago versus what they think now in terms of queer and trans acceptance and understanding. So I just think the web of support, understanding, access, and kind of legitimacy is so much bigger, broader, and deeper. And that is like the world in which we are being attacked and having some things threatened versus in the past like they had nothing, and maybe you could say there's a freedom in that, partly like nobody knows what to make of them, so you're kind of moving around and contesting norms. The binary was so rigid, so there's a way that you're like, you place yourself in relation to the binary. Like female husbands succeeded to some extent because they conformed to one very specific categorical trope of manhood, right? Um, so even though I love to play around in these records and learn about these people and just think it's so incredible and inspiring. Um, I would not trade my life for any of their lives for $10 million. I guess I'll just say that. I think maybe the more interesting question is what happens after medicalization. And because a lot of people who are challenging gender norms and getting slapped on the wrist by police in the 1830s are getting locked up in insane asylums in the 1890s and left there forever, and that's gay and trans people, because if you were thought you were an unchangeable, unredeemable homosexual or trans person in that era, that was a very, very, very dark turn, and that's when that comes with the medicalization of homosexuality. And so I think, you know, that's the era. If you kind of really want to look at the dark times, and I'm sure, if you think about 1890s to 1950s, um, there's a lot of really bad stuff there.
So we have a few more questions here. The next one, so many stories of women presented as men have been told over the years as a way for them to get rights and or possibilities.
Hmm.
How do you parse that in today's world?
You know, there's a couple ways to unpack this. I would say first, as a human being, when you do something dramatic that's not commonly done or widely understood, is it really only motivated by one thing? Like, that's one way I think about it. Like, when you think about your own, gender and sexuality, and as you try to figure it out, is that really only motivated by one singular force, or are there like multiple things at play? And so when people offer these like reductive explanations, like, somebody did that for the money, right? I'm like, why are you so, what? Like, okay, nothing is like, there's, it, why are you so certain? And, you know, and so the past arguments, the way others, as a scholar, I'll say this. These kind of records have gone through now, let's say, three readings. The first is Marxist slash, women's oppression. So, of course, anytime a woman or someone assigned female at birth claims the privileges and autonomy and power and authority that was reserved for men, that was because of oppression, economic, political, legal, both, one or the other. So first of all, I'm like, it's never just economics, it's also political. So yes, you can get a job, but you're also free. You have a whole other set of legal rights that you didn't have before. Okay, fine. Then, lesbian and gay history came along and said, these are our lesbian, queer foremothers. And this is like one of the first ways that Deborah Sampson got read that, of course, really upset people. Like Deborah Sampson is like one of the first cases in, Jonathan Katz's Gay American History. Um, Good for him. He swung for the fences. And so much of like queer and trans history that we have is because of him. I love you, Jonathan. Um, but anyway, so then all of a sudden, any strong woman who did anything like this was a feminist and likely a lesbian. We kind of just owned all of them without any, I mean, it makes no sense in many ways. But because there were actually not even lesbians in this time, like who were real lesbians. But, so that happened. And now I and others are coming along and saying, I'm going to do a trans reading. And I guess I would say the only thing that feels different doing a trans reading of these records than the lesbian turn is the gender move is vague. You know what I mean? We're not saying anybody had a transgender identity because nobody had a transgender identity because nobody had an interior sexual or gender identity in a modern sense. But they transitioned. They made a move. It was very visible. They told people about it. People wrote about it. It was the thing that they did. And so that fits into a bigger body of work in which we're trying to figure out, well, how did people do that? And regardless of what motivated you, how did people pull it off? And how did other people understand it? Like those are just absolutely fascinating questions that need to be interrogated and deserve to be interrogated. And my concluding, point when I say this, which I think disappoints some people because it might just seem like so bland and non-confrontational, but I actually really mean it. I'm just like, listen, most of these cases, we're not really ever going to know if they were motivated by sexual desire, economic mobility, gender expression, liberation, political autonomy, to get away from their family, their religion, their home, whatever. Um, and I think that's fine. Like, I don't care. Like, I don't actually think that's the most interesting, important, pressing question to ask. And as long as we're fighting about that, which is definitely a place, where some people are, we're missing a whole other set of really interesting questions that we can grapple with, that are fun and illuminating and cool. So I will just like resist any reductive claim. You know what I mean? Because I'm also like, you don't have the evidence. Like nobody actually has the evidence to support any simplistic, like singular causal, like, motivation for most of these things. So,
All right. So in our next question, how do you think the broadly publicized and printed stories of female husbands might have influenced later 1900s science, like Magnus Hirschfield's work? Or would
oh,
they
they
have,
definitely, oh, sorry.
oh no,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
and it says, or would they not have been reprinted in non-English speaking countries? But it sounds like they
Oh
did.
no, they did. I mean, the early sexologists like cite these newspaper cases. So it's sexology is complicated, right? There's certainly gay sexologists and certainly part of this movement that felt like they were trying to help us, you know, by saying homosexuality is a disease and not a crime. So that seemed like a radical progressive move to say something is a disease and not a crime. The legacy of that has been totally, absolutely devastating. So, but they absolutely knew about these people. Like these are some of their earliest. Havelock Ellis writes about John Colt, whatever. Like if you when you go through the footnotes of some of their early publications, they're in them. And every, I mean, so the thing about the female husbands that I love and why I feel like, okay, it's a story worth telling is it's not just that there were like 10 female husbands, like living in their little towns. When their stories broke, like they broke and they were reprinted in hundreds of papers all over. And so everybody knew, like everybody's reading about these, like, at least in my, in the Anglo, press. And they're swapping stories, across the Atlantic. So they absolutely, and the earliest, I didn't talk about them because it's a later case, but Joseph Lobdell, who was a famous female husband, wrote a memoir called The Female Hunter, lived in upstate New York. Their life is, they had this tremendous life where they sort of map all of the different 19th century ways that a woman could kind of understand themselves, like Joseph Lobdell goes through. Like they get into a terrible marriage at a young age with like an abusive husband, they have a kid, they're taking care of their disabled parents, so they sort of learn to do everything. They do everything for the family, all of men's tasks, all of women's tasks, and then they also become a school teacher. And then they're like, this sucks. I could make so much more money and to support my family if I lived as a man. They, transgender, they present as a man, they go off. They have this whole trans life where they marry a woman. They're a female husband. So they're sort of, and in the early years, they're celebrated in the 1850s. There's an article about them in the New York Times. Like they're written about a couple times. Like some famous writer stumbled upon them in the woods and wrote about them. Like there's a female hunter in upstate New York doing weird things in the woods that everybody should know about. So they write their own like autobiography and they're like, oh, people think I'm cool. Like this is cool, like to be a woman and to be able to do everything that's expected of a man and a woman is elevated. I mean, this just brings us back to the first question. And then they transgender, they live as a man. They get caught occasionally. They get in legal trouble. They get harassed. They're very, very poor. And and then eventually their brother lines up a group of people to testify before court, and they get committed to an insane asylum where they live for the last 30 years of their life. So suddenly it's like the whole thing turned, and they are the first case study in an American publication by a sexologist diagnosing this category called lesbian. They're a sexual invert, and this publication is also in upstate New York, or comes out of the asylums, upstate New York, and the publication is 1883. So, I'm sorry, I don't even know where that question started, but oh, the sexologists. Yeah. So the sexologists are turning female husbands into sexual inverts.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. We have one from Jason, who is Connecticut College, class of 2012. So he's there when you were. He asks, "I'm curious what happened to James after the court case. After the court case he won over the blackmail case. Did he continue to live as a man even though he had been outed?"
No, I really don't know. But if you're free and you have time to go to try to track it down, I don't know. At least, I probably spent 2 years trying to piece together the life of James Howe and Mary Snapes. And the reports say that they like retreated to, the countryside. Um, but and did what? Like they did something. And years later, they did live for a time because there's this awesome um I don't even know if I have their obituary, but what I have is I might have the obituary, but what I do have is another letter from someone else who writes a letter to the editor and is like, "Dear editor, I thought our readers would like to know of the passing of this person who was no noted in their lifetime, and even though they moved away, that everybody in our community would be interested to know that James Howe, Mary East passed away. Thank you." And it is published in the press. So we do know when they died, but we do not know what happened in the ensuing chunk of time. But that would be a great subject for a work of historical fiction that you might want to write.
All right, well, I'm conscious of the time, so I have one more question for you. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. That we are recording this talk and we'll be sending it out afterwards. And so I wanted to finish up on this question. Said, thank you so much for a very educational presentation. I was specifically interested in the stories of female husbands and the construction of a gender identity. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the concepts of masculinity and femininity in the 18th century. And also, I wanted to know if you have ever encountered a case of male wives. Do we know of any of those?
Yeah, so male wives were not a category. And and I think it's comes back to the first question, which is, well, it's a couple. So that wasn't like an interesting elevation of your status. That wasn't something that people like, oh, we want to know about, male wives. Um, it is also true that female husbands, female soldiers, like this modifier comes out of, the feminist movement of the 18th century and this explosion of literature written by mostly women, but not only, who are trying to document the great accomplishments of women in history. So there's just this like pop in the mid 18th century of books that are like everything that so anytime a woman did something great, it's called the female and whatever great thing she did or whatever great title she held. So that was kind of like circulating as a category that was legible, that also like that had a reading audience. um there are definitely records of trans femme people. I think there's a couple in the news that historians have written about. It's they're just there's not this same kind of binary language category in the same way, to try to find them, or catch them. um, but there's some great scholarship on them, and I forget what was the first part of that question.
They were asking about the concepts of masculinity and
Oh,
femininity.
masking. Yeah, yeah. Well, so right. So I mostly write about this in chapter 2 and 3, where I do try to connect the accounts of female husbands with, the scholarship by, British women and gender historians at the time. It's very classed, right? So depending on what your class is, like, and raced. I'm going to talk about race that much tonight, but you know, it's not just like a free floating category. And so there is a way that dressing a certain way in the, you know, the working class masculinity that's elevated in some of these narratives, maybe not surprising to you, involves drinking, chewing tobacco, being very charming, with women, this kind of stuff. And so what you'll find in the female husband stories, they are written in the most asexual, de-gendered way. Like they're practically neutered, in part because I think, they don't want readers to think about these people having sex or really being fully gendered, embodied people. But where you do find the juicy breakdown of 18th century masculinity is in the sailor stuff. So the sailors aren't threatening in the same way because they aren't married to women, and most of them eventually resume living as women themselves. So in these sailor stories, Hannah Snell, who was James Gray, Lucy, the female shipwright. I have like this is like all my chapter 3. It is so fun because they are full of juicy details about how people embodied masculinity. And it's because that's how you have to know what the codes are for your race and class and location so that you can pass, right? So it was really important. And so there is a lot of stuff in those records about manhood. And sometimes the female's husband's accounts a little bit. It's like, yeah, he seemed like, he chewed tobacco all the time and his hands were rough. Um, so there's some fun stuff in these.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. This has been great, and thank you to our audience too for all of your great questions. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to all of them. And I should have mentioned too that Jen that you also have a really great website where folks can kind of continue to follow your work, learn more about your work, and follow it as well. So I would definitely direct people to that as well. It's jenmanion.com, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, nice and easy. So definitely check that out if you want to learn more about Jen's work. So thank you so much. This really has been just a really wonderful and insightful talk. I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all those wonderful questions, everyone. Stay warm.